In the blood-slicked chess game of the New York underworld, the most expensive piece on the board wasn't a king, it was a conscience. September 12th, 1958. The air in Harlem was thick with the scent of expensive gin and impending tragedy. At 11:47 p.m., the gravity of Lenox Lounge shifted. Big Sam, a man whose shadow had served as Bumpy Johnson's bulletproof vest for half a decade, felt the cold weight of a .38 special burning a hole through his loyalty. The five families had offered a king's ransom of $50,000 for the scalp of the man who ruled 110th Street. To Sam, Bumpy wasn't just a boss. He was the sun Harlem orbited. But even the sun goes dark when the price is right. The choreography was supposed to be surgical. A crowded room, a distracted target, and a single definitive lead hollow point to the base of the skull. Sam stepped forward, the barrel leveling with the man he called brother. The hammer dropped. Click. The sound was a tectonic shift. It wasn't the roar of a gunshot, but the deafening silence of a trap snapping shut. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. He simply turned, his eyes reflecting a decade of cold-blooded wisdom, and uttered the sentence that stripped Sam of his soul. "I've been counting on you." What the history books sanitize, and what the street corners whisper, is that this wasn't a failed assassination. It was a public execution of a man's spirit. Bumpy hadn't just survived. He had orchestrated the entire betrayal. To understand the Machiavellian genius of Bumpy Johnson in 1958, one must realize he wasn't merely a gangster. He was a sovereign state. He was the wall between a vulnerable community and the predatory hunger of the Italian syndicate. The five families viewed Harlem as a colony to be stripped of its resources, the nickels and dimes of the poor that fueled a multi-million-dollar numbers racket. But Bumpy understood a political truth the Italians ignored. Fear is a temporary currency, but respect is an ironclad contract. While the mob ruled with the Tommy gun, Bumpy ruled with the rent check and the political favor. He was the shadow mayor, the man who could silence a police precinct with a whisper or start a riot with a nod. By 1958, the Italians weren't just angry. They were terrified of a man they couldn't buy, break, or bury. The late 1950s in New York was a masterclass in colonial warfare played out on city streets. The five families, the Lucchese, Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno, operated like a sprawling empire hungry for new territory. Harlem was their El Dorado, a gold mine of numbers rackets and local commerce that remained stubbornly independent under Bumpy's iron-fisted benevolence. They viewed Bumpy Johnson as an anomaly, an architectural flaw in their grand design for a unified criminal monopoly. For years, the Italian enforcers had tried to muscle in. They sent men with heavy hands and light minds. Bumpy returned them in pine boxes or bandages, always with a polite note attached for their bosses. They tried to buy the politicians at City Hall, but Bumpy had already secured their loyalty by providing the one thing more valuable than Italian cash: the black vote. He was the gatekeeper of a kingdom they couldn't penetrate. This wasn't just a turf war, it was a clash of civilizations. The Italians operated on the Sicilian code of omerta, but Bumpy operated on the Harlem code of kinship. Desperation is a corrosive emotion, and by the summer of 1958, it had eaten through the patience of the Commission. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the mob, finally realized that Bumpy Johnson couldn't be removed from the outside. The walls were too thick. The community was too loyal. To kill the king of Harlem, they would have to find a way to make the king kill himself. Or, better yet, be killed by the very hands that fed him. They needed a Judas. someone who knew where Bumpy slept, what he feared, and how he took his coffee. They needed Big Sam. Samuel Big Sam Foster was 260 pounds of scar tissue and history. He had been the shield for Bumpy since the early days, a man who had literally intercepted lead intended for his boss. He wasn't just an employee, he was a monument to Bumpy's power. If the five families could turn Big Sam, they wouldn't just be killing a man, they would be destroying the very idea of loyalty in Harlem. The approach was handled with the delicacy of a diplomatic negotiation. Tony the Collector. Marinette was chosen for the task, a man who specialized in the alchemy of turning men into traitors. He didn't use threats. He used the surgical precision of a man's own failures. In August 1958, the trap was set not with a gun, but with a black Cadillac and a briefcase full of broken promises. The seduction of Big Sam did not begin with a bribe. It began with a tragedy that the five families observed like vultures circling a dying animal. In the political theater of 1950s Harlem, information was the only currency that never devalued. Tony Marinette, the syndicate's premier architect of ruin, had spent months studying the hairline fractures in Bumpy Johnson's inner circle. He didn't look for greed. Greed was common and easily spotted. He looked for desperation. He found it in the medical records of a young girl named Keisha, Big Sam's youngest daughter. While Bumpy Johnson was busy negotiating with city councilmen to keep white developers from razing Harlem's historical blocks, Big Sam was drowning in the silent, suffocating debt of a father failing his child. Tuberculosis was a slow executioner, and the private sanitariums that offered a glimmer of hope demanded a price that a bodyguard's salary, even one as prestigious as Bumpy's, could never sustain. Sam had approached Bumpy once, and Bumpy had handed him $2,000 without a second thought. But in the world of high-stakes medical care and specialized doctors, $2,000 was a raindrop in a desert. Sam felt the crushing weight of pride. He couldn't ask again. He felt the shame of a protector who couldn't protect his own blood. On August 20th, 1958, the black Cadillac rolled to the curb of 132nd Street like a hearse for Sam's integrity. Tony Marinette sat in the back, the cooling system of the car humming a lullaby of wealth and privilege that the humid Harlem air couldn't touch. When Sam approached, his hand habitually brushed the grip of his .45, a reflex of loyalty that was already beginning to erode under the acid of his anxiety. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Marinette didn't lead with the hit. He led with the hospital bills. He spoke of the charity wards where the air was thick with death and the doctors were too tired to care. He painted a vivid, agonizing picture of Sam's daughter gasping for breath in a crowded room while the rich girls in Florida recovered in the sun. He wasn't selling a murder. He was selling a father's redemption. When the briefcase opened, the $50,000 didn't look like blood money to Sam. It looked like oxygen. It looked like a future where his daughter didn't die in the shadows of a Harlem tenement. The political brilliance of the five families lay in their timing. They knew that Bumpy Johnson was currently embroiled in a cold war with the Italian mob over the distribution of heroin, a trade Bumpy despised and kept out of his streets. By removing Bumpy, the Italians wouldn't just take the numbers racket, they would turn Harlem into a clearinghouse for the very poison Bumpy fought to keep away. They weren't just buying a bodyguard, they were buying the keys to the kingdom's gates. Sam's hesitation lasted exactly 5 minutes, the time it took for Marinette to describe a clinic in Miami where the best specialists in the country could save Keisha. The ultimatum was the final blow. Marinette made it clear that this was a one-time offer from the commission. If Sam refused, he wasn't just staying loyal to a boss. He was sentencing his daughter to a slow, agonizing death. The choice was framed not as betrayal, but as a trade of one life for another. Sam took the briefcase. He took the debt. And in that moment, the man who had taken 2 bullets for Bumpy Johnson became the very weapon Bumpy's enemies had been searching for decades. But the Italian syndicate had made a fatal error in their political calculus. They assumed that because they had bought Sam, they had outsmarted Bumpy. They viewed the people of Harlem as a disorganized mass of subjects, failing to realize that Bumpy's numbers racket was actually the world's most efficient intelligence agency. Every shoeshine boy on the corner of 125th Street was a censor. Every grandmother watching from a 3rd-story window was a surveillance camera. Every bartender pouring a drink was a confidential informant. To the Italians, Jerome, the parking attendant, was a nobody. A ghost in a grease-stained uniform. To Bumpy, Jerome was a trusted asset. When Jerome saw the black Cadillac, when he noted the license plate that traced back to a shell company in Jersey City, owned by the Genovese family, and when he saw Big Sam, the king's right hand, exit that car with a heavy briefcase, the information moved through the Harlem grapevine with the speed of a lightning strike. By the time Sam reached his apartment to hide the money, Bumpy Johnson was already sitting in his office above Small's Paradise, staring at a slip of paper with Marinet's license plate number. The air in the office was cold. Bumpy didn't rage. He didn't call for his enforcers. He did something far more terrifying. He thought. He analyzed the chessboard. If he killed Sam now, the Italians would simply find another way, another desperate soul. If he confronted Sam, he would lose the tactical advantage of the failed attempt. Bumpy realized that the 5 families weren't just trying to kill him, they were trying to prove that Harlem's loyalty was a myth. They wanted to humiliate the neighborhood by showing that even its protector could be sold. To win, Bumpy wouldn't just need to survive. He would need to turn the assassination into a public ritual of dominance. He would need to let the play proceed to its final act, ensuring that when the curtain fell, the only ones left standing would be the people of Harlem and their king. Bumpy summoned Illinois Gordon, his most tactical associate, not for a hit, but for a delicate operation of sabotage. He contacted Victor, a master gunsmith whose loyalty to Bumpy was forged in the fires of the 1930s gang wars. The plan was no longer about self-preservation. It was about political theater. Bumpy was going to give the 5 families exactly what they wanted, the perfect opportunity to kill him. And he was going to turn it into the greatest defeat in the history of the New York mob. As August bled into September, the tension in the streets became palpable. Sam was a ghost of himself, his hands trembling as he performed his daily duties. Bumpy watched him with a paternal sorrow, seeing the man he loved as a brother slowly dissolve under the weight of his secret. Bumpy wasn't just waiting for a hit, he was waiting for the moment he would have to break his own heart to save his kingdom. In the high-stakes political landscape of 1950s Harlem, Bumpy Johnson knew that a dead king is a martyr, but a fooled king is a punchline. He could not afford to be the latter. As September approached, the air in the Upper Manhattan district grew heavy with the static of an impending storm. The 5 families believed they were orchestrating a coup. Bumpy, however, was busy directing a masterpiece of counter-espionage. The tactical problem was simple but delicate. Bumpy had to ensure the assassination attempt occurred without the risk of a single bullet actually leaving the chamber. He needed Sam to commit the act in the most public forum possible, the Lenox Lounge, to ensure the political fallout would be irreversible. To do this, he reached out to Victor, a man whose hands had shaped the iron history of Harlem for decades. Victor was a master gunsmith who understood the soul of a firearm. When Bumpy requested a ghost gun, a weapon that looked, felt, and smelled of death but remained utterly impotent, Victor didn't ask why. In Bumpy's world, questions were for the weak. Solutions were for the powerful. Victor spent 3 days in a windowless basement, obsessively modifying a .38 Special to match Big Sam's service weapon. He filed down the firing pin until it was a mere stump, unable to reach the primer of a cartridge. He adjusted the internal springs so the trigger pull felt exactly like the crisp 4-pound snap Sam was accustomed to. He even weighted the handle with lead shavings to ensure the balance was identical to the ounce. It was a mechanical lie, a weapon designed for the sole purpose of failing at the most critical moment in a man's life. While the physical weapon was being prepared, Bumpy began the psychological conditioning of his target. In the political arena, if you want a man to act, you must give him the space to breathe his own lies. Bumpy didn't distance himself from Sam, he drew him closer. He took Sam to meetings with the very city officials the Italians were trying to bribe. He let Sam stand behind him while he brokered deals that protected Harlem's autonomy. Every act of kindness was a turn of the screw. Bumpy was forcing Sam to live in the duality of his betrayal. The more Bumpy trusted him, the more the weight of the $50,000 briefcase in Sam's closet felt like a mountain of lead. On September 8th, the opportunity for the Great Swap arrived. Bumpy orchestrated a diversion with the precision of a military operation. He sent Sam on a fool's errand to the furthest reaches of the Bronx, tasked with retrieving a non-existent ledger from a phantom contact. It was a 3-hour window, time enough to change the course of history. Accompanied by Illinois Gordon, Bumpy entered Sam's apartment. The air inside smelled of stale tobacco and the desperate, unwashed scent of a man who hadn't slept in weeks. They found the gun exactly where an amateur would hide it, in a shoebox beneath the bed, nestled next to the briefcase full of Italian blood money. Bumpy stood over the box for a moment, looking at the currency of his brother's treason. He didn't touch the money. To touch it would be to acknowledge its power. Instead, he swapped the lethal .38 for Victor's silent replica. As Bumpy handled the cold steel, he wasn't just thinking about his own safety. He was thinking about the message this would send to Frank Costello and Carlo Gambino. The Italian mob operated on the principle that every man is a commodity with a price tag. By letting Sam keep the money but denying him the kill, Bumpy was going to prove that the grand design of the 5 families was nothing more than a child's game. He was demonstrating that even when they bought the man closest to the throne, they still didn't own the room. The political implications were massive. If Bumpy had simply killed Sam in that apartment, the Italians would have claimed a moral victory, proving that Bumpy's family was as corruptible as theirs. By allowing the play to proceed to the Lenox Lounge, Bumpy was setting the stage for a public humiliation of the entire syndicate. He was going to show the 300 most influential people in Harlem, the voters, the business owners, the preachers, that the Italian mob was a paper tiger. For the next 4 days, the tension reached a crescendo. Sam returned from the Bronx, oblivious to the fact that his sting had been pulled. He carried the ghost gun on his hip, its weight a constant reminder of the Florida future he had bought for his daughter. Bumpy, meanwhile, moved through Harlem with an eerie, saint-like calm. He visited the sick, he settled disputes between local shopkeepers, and he held court at Small's Paradise, all while knowing that his shadow was waiting for the right second to pull the trigger. Bumpy's strategy was a masterclass in the long game. Most men in the underworld reacted to threats with immediate violence, a trait the Italians counted on. Bumpy, however, utilized the political weapon of patience. He understood that the greatest way to destroy an enemy isn't to kill them, but to make their best-laid plans look ridiculous. He was preparing to turn a murder attempt into a piece of street theater that would be talked about for generations. As the clock ticked toward midnight on September 12th, Bumpy performed his final check. He knew the Lenox Lounge would be packed. He knew the Italians would have their own scouts in the room to witness the fall of the King of Harlem. He dressed in his finest charcoal suit, placed his signature fedora on his head, and looked at himself in the mirror. He wasn't looking at a gangster. He was looking at a strategist who had already won a war that his opponents didn't even know had started. The stage was set. The gun was cold. The target was ready. All that remained was for the traitor to play his part. The atmosphere inside Lenox Lounge on the night of September 12, 1958, was not merely festive. It was a curated display of Harlem's political and cultural sovereignty. The air was a thick, swirling cocktail of expensive cognac, blue cigarette smoke, and the frenetic energy of hard bop jazz. This was the sanctuary of the elite, the boardroom of the streets, and the fortress of Bumpy Johnson. To the 300 people packed into the velvet-lined booths, the night was a celebration of their community's resilience. To the man sitting at the corner table with his back to the door, it was the final stage of a political execution. Bumpy Johnson sat with an almost supernatural stillness. He was flanked by 2 city councilmen, men who held the keys to urban development and municipal contracts. They were deep in a heated discussion about housing projects in Sugar Hill, oblivious to the fact that they were serving as the backdrop for a Shakespearean tragedy. Bumpy leaned in, nodding with gravitas, his trademark fedora resting on the table like a crown. He was the picture of a man at peace, a leader who had already secured his borders, yet every sense was calibrated to the rhythmic opening and closing of the front door. At 11:30 p.m., Big Sam crossed the threshold. The shift in the room was subtle, but, to Bumpy, it was as loud as a siren. Sam didn't enter with the silent, predatory grace of a bodyguard. He moved with the leaden, stumbling gait of a man carrying the weight of 1,000 sins. He had been drinking, but the alcohol hadn't provided the intended numbness. Instead, it had sharpened his fear into a jagged edge that cut through his resolve. In his jacket pocket, his hand was a claw, gripping the cold steel of the modified .38 Special, the weapon he believed would buy his daughter's life and his family's exile to the sun-drenched safety of Miami. The irony was a razor's edge. Sam scanned the room, his eyes darting past the musicians and the waitresses, searching for the very man he was supposed to protect. He saw the back of Bumpy's head, that familiar salt-and-pepper hairline that he had watched over for 5 years. To any other observer, Bumpy was a target of opportunity. To Bumpy, his own vulnerability was the bait in a trap designed to catch a much larger predator than Sam. The political subtext of the room was a silent roar. Scattered among the tables were observers from the 5 families, men in sharp, ill-fitting suits who stood out like oil in water. They were there to witness the decapitation of Harlem's leadership. They whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on Sam as he moved toward the bar. They were the architects of this betrayal, the men who believed that $50,000 could rewrite the laws of loyalty that Bumpy had spent decades drafting. Sam reached the bar, his breathing labored, his chest a furnace of anxiety. Every second that passed was a second he spent drowning. He looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. The hit was scheduled for 11:47, a precise moment calculated by the Italians to coincide with the shift change of the local patrol cars outside. The choreography of the underworld was a dance of gears and springs, and Sam was the broken cog that was about to jam the entire machine. At 11:46 p.m., Sam began his walk. It was a journey of only 30 feet, but it felt like a march across a continent. The jazz band was mid-set, the trumpet player hitting a high, mournful note that seemed to scream Sam's name. He passed the businessmen, the hustlers, and the dreamers, all of whom gave him a respectful nod as he passed. He was Big Sam, the king's shield. Nobody suspected the blade he carried. Bumpy did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't even stiffen his shoulders. He continued his conversation about the Sugar Hill development, his voice calm and melodic, even as he felt the air pressure change behind him. He could hear Sam's footsteps, the familiar cadence he had trusted his life to for half a decade. The betrayal was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical presence, 6 feet away, then 4, then 2. The bartender, a man named Eddie who had seen Bumpy survive 3 wars, was the first to see the gun. His eyes went wide, his hand froze on the soda siphon, and the world seemed to decelerate into a series of static frames. Sam drew the .38. The motion was clumsy, frantic, stripped of the professional efficiency he usually possessed. He leveled the barrel at the base of Bumpy's skull, the dark hole of the muzzle a void that promised an end to Bumpy's reign and Sam's guilt. 11:47 p.m., the moment of the great pivot. Sam's finger tightened. The internal mechanics of the gun, modified by Victor's surgical hands, moved in a silent, useless dance. The hammer dropped. Click. The sound was small, a mere metallic snap. But in the sudden, psychic silence of the Lenox Lounge, it sounded like a thunderclap. The trumpet player stopped. The laughter died. The clinking of glasses evaporated. 300 people were frozen in a tableau of horror, staring at the man they loved as a brother, standing over the man they revered as a god, with a weapon that had just refused to kill. Bumpy Johnson took a slow, deliberate sip of his cognac. He let the liquid burn his throat, savoring the taste of a victory that had been won weeks ago. He set the glass down with a gentle clink that echoed through the silent room, and then, with the agonizing slowness of a man who owns time itself, he turned his chair to face his assassin. He didn't look at the gun. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly into Sam's soul, his eyes devoid of the rage Sam expected. Instead, they were filled with a cold, analytical disappointment that was far more devastating than any bullet. The political master of Harlem had allowed himself to be touched only to prove that he was, in fact, untouchable. The room held its breath. The 5 family's observers began to slip toward the exits, realizing that they hadn't just witnessed a failed hit. They had witnessed a declaration of war. Bumpy opened his mouth, and the 5 words he uttered didn't just break Sam. They shattered the foundation of the Italian mob's influence in Harlem forever. "I've been counting on you." The aftermath of the click was not an explosion of violence, but a vacuum of power. In the political ecosystem of Harlem, the silence in Lenox Lounge was a devastating indictment of the Italian syndicate's incompetence. Big Sam stood paralyzed, the useless weapon still extended, his arm shaking with a tremor that telegraphed his utter psychological collapse. He looked like a man who had jumped off a cliff, only to find the ground had disappeared. Bumpy Johnson remained seated, the embodiment of a sovereign who had successfully baited an empire into a trap. He didn't signal for his men to execute Sam. Instead, he allowed the weight of the moment to do the work. This was the pinnacle of Bumpy's political theater. He was demonstrating that he didn't need to kill a traitor to destroy him. By letting Sam stand there in front of the community's most influential figures, Bumpy was stripping Sam of his humanity, his honor, and his history in real time. The 5 words, "I've been counting on you," acted as a corrosive agent. They signaled to every observer in the room that Bumpy was not a victim of circumstance, but the architect of his own survival. It told the hidden Mafia scouts that their insider information was a manufactured lie fed to them by the very man they sought to eliminate. The political message was clear. There is no secret in Harlem that Bumpy Johnson does not own. Bumpy reached out and gently took the gun from Sam's limp hand. He examined it with the curiosity of a man looking at a flawed piece of jewelry. He laid it on the table next to his fedora, a symbolic gesture of disarming his enemies without breaking a sweat. Sam's knees finally gave out. He collapsed into the sawdust on the floor, a heap of broken muscle and shattered intent. The man who had been a titan of the streets was now a sobbing wreck, begging for a mercy he didn't think he deserved. The dialogue that followed was not a conversation, but a public sentencing. Bumpy spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the lounge, amplified by the absolute stillness of the crowd. He revealed his knowledge of the $50,000, the secret meetings in the black Cadillac, and the desperate plight of Sam's daughter. He wasn't just exposing a crime, he was exposing a failure of faith. In a move of sheer political genius, Bumpy produced a thick manila envelope from his inner jacket pocket. He didn't throw it at Sam. He placed it on the table with the reverence of a legal document. Inside were receipts, not for gambling debts or illegal shipments, but for the full payment of Kesha's medical bills at the highest-rated private facility in the Northeast. Bumpy had used the very money the Italians were trying to squeeze him for to save the daughter of the man trying to kill him. This was the ultimate checkmate in the war of optics. By paying the bills himself, Bumpy proved that his numbers racket was a more reliable social safety net than the false promises of the five families. He showed that while the Italians offered money to destroy, he offered resources to heal. The room watched as Sam realized that the Miami dream the Italians sold him was a hollow imitation of the protection Bumpy had already provided. Bumpy's mercy was more agonizing than a bullet. He didn't call the police, and he didn't call the undertaker. He told Sam to get up. He told him to take the envelope and the remaining cash he'd hidden in his apartment, and to leave. The sentence was exile. In the world of the 1950s, being cast out of Harlem by Bumpy Johnson was a social death. Sam would be a ghost, wandering through other cities, carrying the mark of the man who sold his brother for a briefcase that was never meant to open. As Sam stumbled out of the lounge, the gun still sitting on Bumpy's table like a trophy, the political landscape of New York shifted. The observers for the five families vanished into the night, racing to find a payphone to tell Frank Costello that the mission had failed in the most humiliating way possible. They hadn't just lost a hitman. They had lost their aura of invincibility. Bumpy stood up then. He didn't look tired or shaken. He looked like a man who had just finished a routine business meeting. He adjusted his suit, placed his fedora back on his head, and turned to the crowd. The jazz band remained silent, waiting for the king to speak. Bumpy didn't give a speech. He simply picked up his glass, finished the last drop of cognac, and nodded to the band leader. The message was sent. The hit was over. But the war for Harlem's soul had just entered a new, more aggressive phase. Bumpy had proven he could outthink the five families. Now, he had to prove he could make them pay for the insult of trying to turn his own shadow against him. The failure at Lenox Lounge was not a localized disaster. It was a systemic collapse of the five families' intelligence network. By the early hours of September 13th, the myth of Italian supremacy was bleeding out on the pavement of 125th Street. While Harlem celebrated a victory of loyalty over greed, the epicenter of the New York underworld was vibrating with a different kind of energy, cold, concentrated fury. In a windowless basement in East Harlem, neutral territory, an emergency summit of the commission was convened. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of expensive cigars and the heavy scent of failure. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, predatory beat on the mahogany surface. Across from him, Carlo Gambino sat in shadow, his face a mask of inscrutable calculation. Tony Marinette, the specialist who had promised a clean decapitation of the Johnson regime, stood against the wall, his skin the color of wet ash. The political fallout was immediate. The news that Bumpy Johnson had not only survived, but had publicly disarmed and humiliated his assassin was a blow to the syndicate's credit rating. In the world of organized crime, perception is the only collateral that matters. If a neighborhood king could mock the collective will of the 5 families, then every local boss from Brooklyn to the Bronx would begin to question the percentage they paid to the commission. Costello's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a raspy whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. He didn't scream, he analyzed. He noted that they had spent 3 months, $30,000 in bribes, and $50,000 in bait, only to hand Bumpy Johnson the greatest propaganda victory of his career. The Italians had tried to play the game of turning a man's heart, but they had failed to realize that Bumpy already owned the hospital where that heart was being treated. Gambino, ever the strategist, saw the deeper problem. He pointed out that Bumpy hadn't just sabotaged a gun, he had sabotaged their reputation. By letting Sam walk out alive, Bumpy had projected a level of power that was almost messianic. He didn't need to kill to exert his will. That kind of moral authority was more dangerous to the 5 families than 1,000 soldiers. It made Bumpy a political martyr while he was still breathing. The tension in the room shifted toward Tony Marinette. In the Italian code, failure of this magnitude required a blood sacrifice. But as the enforcers stepped forward, Gambino raised a hand. He argued that killing Marinette would be another reactive move in a game where Bumpy was already 10 moves ahead. Bumpy wanted them to turn on each other. He wanted the 5 families to dissolve into internal recriminations and street wars. Instead, Gambino proposed a radical political retreat. He realized that Harlem was no longer a territory to be conquered. It was a sovereign nation with a nuclear deterrent, Bumpy's intellect. The cost of taking Harlem was now higher than the value of the numbers racket itself. Every soldier sent into those streets would be walking into a maze where the walls themselves were loyal to Johnson. This was the first time in the history of the American Mafia that the Commission officially sanctioned a tactical withdrawal. They weren't just backing down from a street fight, they were conceding a geopolitical border. The order was issued. Harlem was to be treated as an independent state. No more hits, no more bribes, no more muscle. The 5 families would focus their colonial ambitions on the outer boroughs, leaving the King of Harlem to rule his kingdom in peace. The political map of New York was redrawn that night. Bumpy Johnson had achieved what no other black leader in the criminal or political sphere had ever accomplished. He had forced the most powerful criminal organization in the Western world to recognize his borders. He didn't do it with a massacre. He did it by understanding the price of a man's soul and paying it before his enemies could. While the mob bosses retreated into their shadows, Bumpy Johnson was back at Small's Paradise. He wasn't celebrating. He was sitting with Illinois Gordon, looking at the .38 special that sat on his desk. He knew the peace would be fragile, and he knew the Italians would wait for a moment of weakness. But for now, the message was clear. You don't play chess with a man who owns the board, the pieces, and the very air in the room. The legend of the Night of the Click did not remain confined to the smoke-filled corners of Lenox Lounge. It became the new gospel of the Harlem streets. In the political vacuum left by the retreating Italian syndicate, Bumpy Johnson's stature transitioned from that of a mere underworld figure to a folk hero of mythic proportions. The story was a masterclass in psychological warfare that resonated through every barbershop, church pew, and social club from 110th Street to the Polo Grounds. The brilliance of Bumpy's maneuver was its satirical edge. He had allowed the most feared criminal organization in America to spend months planning his demise, only to turn their high-stakes assassination attempt into a comedy of errors. By the time the sun rose on September 13th, the narrative had been solidified. The five families weren't just dangerous, they were foolish. They had been outmaneuvered by the very community they sought to colonize. This was the ultimate political victory, stripping an oppressor of their ability to inspire fear. Bumpy leaned into this new political reality with the precision of a seasoned statesman. He didn't gloat or hold victory parades. Instead, he intensified his civic presence. He was seen at the local markets, shaking hands with the vendors who had served as his eyes and ears. He increased his donations to local schools and churches, subtly reminding everyone that the numbers racket was the economic engine that kept Harlem's head above water. While the Italian mob was an extractive empire, Bumpy presented himself as a self-sustaining ecosystem. The satirical nature of the event became a tool for community pride. Jokes began to circulate about the Italian iron, guns that only made noise when Bumpy said they could. This laughter was a form of political resistance. For decades, the shadow of the Mafia had loomed over black businesses in New York, a constant threat of protection taxes and violent takeovers. Now, that shadow had been chased back across the East River by a man who didn't even have to fire a shot to defend his crown. However, the internal political cost for Bumpy was hidden beneath his stoic exterior. The betrayal by Big Sam had left a scar that no amount of public adoration could heal. To Bumpy, loyalty wasn't a business transaction. It was a sacred covenant. In the quiet hours of his office, he realized that the very power he used to protect Harlem had also made him an island. The $50,000 price tag on his head wasn't just a bounty. It was a testament to the isolation of leadership. Bumpy utilized the story of Big Sam as a cautionary tale for his remaining associates. He didn't use it to threaten them, but to educate them on the mechanics of power. He taught them that the Italians would always look for the kesha in their lives, the point of desperation that could be leveraged. He shifted his organization's structure, creating a more robust social support system for his men, ensuring that no one would ever feel they had to choose between their family's survival and their loyalty to the neighborhood. By late 1958, Bumpy Johnson had essentially achieved diplomatic immunity. The New York Police Department, sensing the shift in the winds, became more hesitant to harass Bumpy's operations. They recognized that Bumpy provided a level of stability that their own precincts could not. He was the shadow governor, a man who could stop a riot with a phone call or provide a pension for a widow with a nod. He had successfully fused criminal enterprise with political sovereignty, creating a model of power that the history books would never fully dare to document. The five families remained true to their retreat, but they watched from a distance with a mixture of respect and resentment. They realized that Bumpy hadn't just saved his own life, he had redefined the rules of engagement. He had proven that in the urban jungle, the most dangerous weapon isn't the gun you carry, but the loyalty you earn and the intelligence you cultivate. The story of the Silent 38 Special was now the bedrock of Bumpy's reign, a reign that would remain unchallenged for another decade. The final chapter of Bumpy Johnson's reign was not written in the ink of a new war, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a man who had already won the only battle that mattered. For 10 years following the Night of the Click, Bumpy moved through Harlem with the aura of a ghost who refused to leave his throne. He had reached a level of political deification where his mere presence at a sidewalk cafe was enough to settle labor disputes and quiet the ambitions of younger, hungrier men who thought they could play the game he had mastered. The five families kept their word, not out of a sense of honor, but out of a deep existential dread. Carlo Gambino's decree remained the law of the underworld. Harlem belongs to Bumpy. The Italian syndicate had learned the hard way that Bumpy wasn't just a gangster they could rub out. He was a living symbol of a community that had stopped fearing their shadows. Every time a mob boss in Brooklyn looked at a map of Manhattan, they saw a black hole over Harlem, a territory where their money was worthless and their guns were silent. The satire of Big Sam's failure lived on in the oral history of the neighborhood. It became a cultural shorthand for the Bumpy way. When someone tried to outsmart the neighborhood, the elders would smile and whisper about the man who let his assassin pull the trigger just to show him it was empty. It was the ultimate political metaphor for the African-American experience in the mid-century, facing down a loaded system and proving that its mechanisms of destruction were hollow when confronted with true unity and superior intellect. Ironically, history came full circle in 1968. On a warm July night, Bumpy Johnson walked into the Lenox Lounge. He was older, his movements slower, but his eyes still held the sharp, analytical glint of a grand master. He sat at the same corner table where Big Sam had once aimed a dud .38 at his skull. He ordered the same Kanak. He was 70 years old, a survivor of 3 decades of gang wars, federal prison stints, and countless assassination plots. He didn't die from a bullet. He didn't die from a betrayal. He died from a heart attack, leaning back in his chair in the very room where he had performed his greatest act of political theater. As his heart gave out, the room went silent once more. Not out of fear this time, but out of a profound collective grief. The man who had been the wall of Harlem had finally stepped aside, leaving a vacuum that no one else would ever truly fill. The legacy of that night in 1958 remained his greatest contribution to the street-level political theory of New York. Bumpy had proven that real power is the ability to turn an opponent's strength into their greatest weakness. He had played chess with the 5 families while they were still trying to figure out the rules of checkers. He showed that a leader's greatest asset isn't the size of his army, but the depth of his intelligence and the loyalty he fosters by taking care of his people before they even know they need it. Big Sam, the man who took the $50,000 and left with nothing but shame, lived out his days in the gray industrial sprawl of Detroit. He never spoke of Bumpy again, but it was said that every time he heard a metallic click, a car door closing, a light switch flipping, he would flinch, expecting to see the disappointed eyes of the king he had tried to kill. He was the living proof that Bumpy's mercy was a far more enduring punishment than his wrath. When the history books speak of the 1960s, they talk about the great political shifts and the civil rights icons. But, in the neon-lit corridors of Harlem, they still tell the story of the man who knew the hit was coming for 3 weeks. They talk about the king who paid his assassin's bills and handed him a broken gun. They talk about Bumpy Johnson, the man who taught the world that in the game of power, the most dangerous weapon is always the one the enemy thinks they have, but you already own.